I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Islesboro Forum Committee to the first program of the 2022 Speaker Series. This is our 30th consecutive year, so yes! We've proved to be fairly durable. My name is Gayle Jackson. I'll be your moderator this evening. And I just will say a couple of things about the series this summer. In 2020, because of COVID, we did everything via Zoom. In 2021, we had a hybrid situation where we had in-person and some Zoom and a little bit of this and a little bit of that. This year, it's going to be all in-person. It's wonderful to see so many warm human bodies here tonight. I love it. But we will record it thanks to our technical producer, Michael Hutcherson, whom you all know. Big round of applause for Michael. And he will see to it that the recorded program is posted at the website, islesboroforum.org. And also if you just enter it on YouTube, it will come up. So there will be several ways to get at it if you wish to do so. Before we introduce our speaker, I would like to take just a minute to thank the Islesboro Forum Committee. There are 7 of us. They are listed on the website. I won't go through all of their names now, but they all contribute in very important ways, mainly with excellent ideas and connections to speakers. We have a wonderful roster of speakers this summer. You can go to the islesboroforum.org website and see who the rest of the speakers are for the season. I'd like to also just make a plug for this little basket here. It loves to receive donations from you. For our 6 programs, it will cost in the range of $1,500. So a little bit of, oh, thank you, yay, Bruce. Yes, priming the pump there, that's great. Our format tonight is just a little different from what we usually follow at the request of our speaker. He wants to give you a few brief remarks at the beginning on his observations from really a professional lifetime of studying Russian history and more recently the conflict between the Putin regime and Ukraine. So then we will follow that with as many questions from you as you would like to raise with him. We thought that, or he thought, I should say, that we've all been exposed so much to the coverage of Ukraine, it would be hard for him to know just what most interests you about it. So your questions will bring that to the surface. I will ask Bruce Claflin to introduce our speaker, and our speaker is a longtime summer resident, Dr. William Rosenberg. So Bruce, if you would come up here, I will cede the podium to you.
Thanks, Gail. Good evening. A few years ago, I joined a group of men who were having lunch. And they were discussing current events, and one thing led to another, and it ended up talking about Russia. Now, being men, we all spoke with great authority and knowledge on this subject, until finally, one person who had been silent spoke up, and we realized that his knowledge on this subject was 10 orders of magnitude beyond our own. We sat there humbled, listened, and learned, as I hope we all will tonight. Now, it's no wonder that he knew what he was talking about, because our speaker tonight is the Professor of Russian History Emeritus at the University of Michigan, and he's Vice Chair of the Board of Trustees of the European University at St. Petersburg, Russia. Bill made his first of countless trips to Russia in 1967. It wasn't popular then, it was at the height of the Cold War. And now Bill and his wife Ellie are long-term summer residents. Let's bring Bill up.
Somehow I don't remember that men's lunch. So yes, what I like to do is very quickly sketch out 4 or 5 points of entry into a very complicated and dismal subject, the war in Ukraine, and then say a few words about my recent personal experiences in the process in the aspects of the war that I have been engaged in, and then give you a chance to tell me which areas you'd like to ask questions about, or if that doesn't work, I can say a few more words about each of the themes that I have. Now, the first thing that I think we have to realize is, and it's wonderful to see such a large audience on such a beautiful day to discuss a really dismal subject, the subject could not be more dire, it seems to me, or more important for the future of the European and North American order. The first thing I want to say is that the Ukraine problem, the Ukraine conflict, is not simply a Ukraine conflict. It engages the future of Europe, the stability of Europe, the European order after the Second World War, the whole question of rule of law. It affects China and its relationship to Taiwan, and is a complicated and difficult subject which, if we focus too much on the brutality and the awful, horrific destruction of Ukraine, we may miss these implications. And I would say here that it stresses me when I read, like in this morning's New York Times, that there is a fatigue with the problem and the issue of Ukraine. And it's a mounting fatigue. And I'm reminded of 1938, when there was such a fatigue with it was Germany that Attlee and Daladier came to Munich to have peace in our time. We're not going to worry about this anymore. So that's the first area. Now, the second area we could talk is my view and your view of the possible outcomes. My views might surprise some of you. We're not talking about anything we can say with great confidence. This would be speculative. Historians have enough problem understanding the past, much less understanding the future. But I would say that none of the outcomes to the current climate is a good, to the current situation, to the current war, is a good one. And it's an unusual historical moment when you look at this conjunction of events and forces, and the best you can possibly say is what might be the least worst outcome in a context where no outcome is good. It is extraordinarily difficult, however much you watch CNN and the pundits, it's extraordinarily difficult, it will be extraordinarily difficult to get this right. That is to have an outcome and to understand what the best possible outcome is. But the consequences of not trying to do that, I think, are perilous. Now, obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but I'm very happy to talk about the historical underpinnings of this event, both Russian and Ukrainian, and both the longer term and the shorter term histories and Russian-Ukrainian relations in both the shorter term and the longer term. This will involve the rise of nature of Ukrainian nationalism, Russian nationalism, the shorter term processes, the shorter term historical processes, which I would date from 1991, might surprise you. And I have some things I might want to say about this and not be familiar to you. And here, of course, we can deal with the Crimea, we can do with Maidan, we can do with the Minsk Accords, we can do with the succession of Ukrainian presidents, the constitutional changes, all the rest of it, if it's interesting to you. Then, fourthly, there is the question of how to understand the specifics. And here I don't profess any expertise at all. By specifics, I mean sanctions and have we done the sanctions right? You know, the sanctions effective, and how is it affecting people in Russia? Is that a good thing? Not a good thing? As well as some aspects of this, the question of the degradation of the Russian army, the nature of the Russian army forces, the contrast to Ukraine, and so on and so forth. There's an enormous amount of this, I think, in the newspaper and on television, so this might not be something you would want to spend too much time on. But first, before we come to these themes, I want to say a few things about the effect of this catastrophe, it's not too strong a word, disaster on contemporary Russia. We're pretty well aware of what the catastrophe is for contemporary Ukraine, although I don't think we've factored in what the longer-term effects will be of a nation of 40 million people, 10 million of whom have now been displaced and are out of Russia. The trauma, especially for younger people and children, the trauma that they have lived through and how that will affect their lives and their attitudes and their behaviors, which is a terribly important question. My Ukrainian friends don't want me talking about the same sort of thing that is affecting people in Russia, so I want to say a few words about that. And I think it's important to distinguish between Russia and Putin's regime, because Putin's regime is not Russia. And by Russia, I mean Russian society with its complexities, with its different strata of the population, Russian society that is educated, parts of Russian society not educated, the difference between my colleagues, long-term colleagues in Russia who are educated, who do have access to internet, who can, or used to, I mean, until very recently, listen to BBC and listen to CNN, and the ways in which February 24th has laid an enormous veil of disappointment over all of them. And not simply disappointment. Russia, in some sense, to encapsulate Russian history in an aphorism, Russian history really is something of a dialect between hope and disappointment. The hopes come in various forms, Russian modernity, Russian success, and the disappointments are it never has quite worked historically. And what has happened after February 24th in Russia fits that pattern to a T and in a dismal way. Because since 1991, the universal hope of people who are in the intelligentsia or the academic area or professional fields, youngsters in particular, the first generation born after 1991, the hope universally has been, we will live in a normal country, finally. And I've heard this repeatedly in the 1990s, in my many trips since. We are striving to be a normal country. What is a normal country? You know, normal country, like France and Italy and, you know, a normal country. As Gorbachev said, Europe from London to Vladivostok. And it's come as an enormous, crushing disappointment that the February 24th change of direction, although obviously there are near-term historical antecedents, has finally convinced and finally persuaded and finally brought to clear consciousness that Russia is not a normal country. And normalcy has not been achieved. And normalcy probably will not be achieved in the ways in which the country as a whole, post-Soviet society as a whole, expected and hoped in 1991. Now, I see this through the prism of my colleagues at the European University, where I've served as on the Board of Trustees almost since the beginning, founded in 1994 with the help of the city government and Mayor Sobchak, and bringing together the best of the Russian scholarly traditions and European scholarly traditions, especially in the area of social science. Social sciences like anthropology that hadn't been taught in Russia, history that hadn't been taught in the post-revolutionary period. There were virtually no Soviet historians of Soviet Russia in Soviet Russia for its own reason. And over the course of the last, 20 years or more, about 20 years I suppose, maybe, no, it's almost 30 years. A large number of the best and the brightest have graduated, gone to Russian universities. One is teaching, now tenured at Princeton. One is teaching, now tenured at the University of Washington. One is tenured at the University of Maryland. And the interactions between them and the world community of scholars in all these different fields of social science has been enormous. And these folks, as well as their extensions in the professional field, in the field of business, in the field of teaching, have been devastated by these events. especially younger students and younger faculty who in talking to them over the last several months, now feel rather desperate that they cannot pursue a career in Russia. They cannot pursue a career in Russia using what they've learned at European University, but nor can they go abroad for reasons that have to do with the heavy nature of the sanctions that would come down on their families and come down on them, or because they have responsibilities to their children, to their grandchildren. And the dilemma that they face is an exquisite one. Should I stay and take the risk of being arrested? Should I leave and take the risk of not seeing my parents again? Being arrested is, you must understand in this context, you must understand the degree to which repression actually works. We sometimes underestimate repression. But the new law, which makes it punishable up to 8 to 10 years in prison, which was just aired in the Duma this week, for consorting with a Westerner, a Russian consorting with a Westerner, and therefore going to be under the influence of that person's ideas and views, is subject to 8 to 10 years in prison. And there have been enough arrests in the scholarly community. Last week, 2 weeks ago, I guess it is by now, the rector of the state university for governmental studies and economics was arrested. And he was arrested for embezzling. That's the easiest way to be arrested in Russia these days. If you're an oppositional figure to the regime, be charged with embezzlement of funds, and he's under house arrest. And my colleagues in St. Petersburg are waiting for the shoe to drop, but they're not sure that if they should leave St. Petersburg and send the message that they're leaving St. Petersburg, the shoe won't drop more quickly. And some of them will be made an example of because of the outflow of educated people that Putin is desperately trying to stop. More than 100,000 Russians in this class, general social class, have left since February 24th, according to Kommersant, which is the leading liberal newspaper, still liberal newspaper in Moscow. And the struggle is a struggle that Hannah Arendt really quite remarkably laid out after the Eichmann trial. What is personal responsibility in a dictatorship? Do you acquiesce to it? Do you escape it? Do you leave it? Do you fight it? These are very, in Russian you would say, aktualные problems, actual problems, pressing problems that each of my friends and colleagues in Russia and in Ukraine are dealing with. In Ukraine it's somewhat different, of course. The whole infrastructure of higher education and professional life has been damaged. And another association that I've been involved in, an international association of humanists, which brought together Ukrainians, Russians, and people from Belarus for the last 6 or 7 years, and very successfully brought young people into contact with each other, has of course entirely dissolved. That took me to Kharkiv, it took me to Lviv, many times to Kiev and other parts of Ukraine. What is your pleasure? Would you like to ask me to talk about or to raise a question or comments about any one of these areas, or should I go back over them and say a few more words about each? Yes, please.
How might Putin not be in power in the future? How could that occur?
So how might Putin be disempowered in the future? How might that occur? Well, that touches the question of the shorter-term historical processes which I think underlie this event. One of the great failures of post-Soviet Russia, unlike post-Soviet Ukraine, is the failure to develop an institutional system which would have some restraints on power, and a failure to develop even a constitutional court, which is the issue in Ukraine, much less a governing structure like the Duma, the Rada, very powerful in Ukraine, the Duma in Russia, really with no power. Failure to develop these institutions, which in a sense and necessarily left a vacuum that someone like Putin was clever enough to fill. And what that means is that there's no institutional way to remove Putin, as there was in Ukraine, to remove Yanukovych. There is no institutional form for doing this. The Security Council is not a Security Council in Russia. And I would contrast that to the Soviet Union. Because the Soviet Union, however one finds its policies problematic, did have a central committee and did have a Politburo. And Khrushchev was responsible to the Politburo. And Politburo was responsible to the central committee. And Khrushchev couldn't complete the arms to the missiles to Cuba. The Politburo said no. And this is true. In Gorbachev's case, the Politburo said yes and stood with him. So these institutions were restraints on the accumulation of power. They were set firmly in Russia after the Stalin era, but even in the Stalin period, there were certain institutional restraints, even on Stalin's behavior. So the answer to your question is I haven't the slightest idea how. And I don't, not only do I not have the slightest idea, the oligarchs will not remove Putin. The army will not remove Putin. The KGB will not remove Putin. And I don't know what is left. Popular protests will not remove Putin. That will only result in even more repression that's already been laid on society. So that's one reason why I think the situation is so dire, because we have no easy way to replace political leadership in Russia. Russians have no easy way of doing that.
I just finished reading Lenin's Tomb by David
Yeah.
Remnick,
Yes.
which was about all the Gorbachev and the opening up, and then also some reaction against Gorbachev and Yeltsin coming in. So it seemed like there was a lot of pushback by the conservatives against all of that opening. And so I guess I'm asking that the next step is how was Putin able to take something that was opening up in the early 90s, and when he came in, he systematically, over many years, took governorships away, centralized all of this power. How was he able to do that? Because you said the result is there are no structures, but he did that. I mean, he succeeded in getting rid of those over many years.
It was not only him. I mean,
Well,
Yeltsin, it was Yeltsin, and if you got to the point of Western engagement in the 1990s, we can lay some of the blame on the Western advisors who were overwhelmingly concerned with the economy and transforming a socialist economy into a capitalist economy, and what's the word that escapes me now, the shock therapy of the economy than they were for institution building. So no one paid, I shouldn't say no one, I know several people were very active in trying to construct a constitution, but the Constitutional Court wasn't established until 1967 after the second election. So how did Putin do it? There have been several good books on this. Karen DeWish's book on Putin. The rector of the university that I'm associated with wrote a good book in Russian on this. And he did it because the principal problem at the end of the 1990s as a consequence of Yeltsin's weakness, you may remember, was corruption, crime, and what you used to see on the evening news, the mafia. The Russian mafia, which boasted itself as being more powerful than the Italian mafia, and controlled the railroad stations and controlled the kiosks and increasingly controlled Russian society. And Putin's initial popularity was that he was not within Yeltsin's fairly corrupt inner circle, and there was a great hope that with his KGB background and connections, he would be able to suppress the mafia and move in the direction of a democratizing what by the end of the 1990s was already a kleptocracy rather than a democracy. And he said that, Putin, in his inaugural address, that he planned to be president for 4 years. That was his purpose and task, to move Russia now into a democratic order. What he did, in fact, was appoint the mafia bosses to important positions in Russian industry, in companies, and in the government. He basically, over the first 4 years, absorbed the mafia into the government. So that by the end of his first term in 2004, it was the government that people saw as corrupt and as violent and behaving like the mafia, but there was no longer an independent force, mafia force, that could contend with him, against him. And as that happened, his control over Russian society increased. It increased incrementally, but it increased. The university I was am affiliated with, although to protect our colleagues, we've just been asked to resign from our positions at the European University because the very fact of having Americans on the Board of Trustees, much less a vice chair of the Board of Trustees, puts our colleagues in grave danger. So we submitted our resignations together in order to, we're not entirely ending our relationship and we're other plans, but in the sense of St. Petersburg, we're trying to protect them. Our university was first closed down in 2008 by the city authorities, and then it was closed down in 2016 by the authorities, and it could be closed down tomorrow and no one would be surprised. But in the course of this incremental period, Putin consolidated more and more his power because by both the imprisonment of people like Khodorkovsky, who was a principal contender. Khodorkovsky, once the richest man in Russia, is now a prominent figure in emigration. He got his fortune, like so many others, in the gas industry, in the oil and resource industry. Khodorkovsky's arrest for 8 years was a signal that you don't mess with Russian politics. And in the case of the European University, the same sort of thing. You people are under our sights. You need to be cautious. It has not constrained my colleagues there, I'm happy to say, until now. When even talking about the war in Ukraine is against Russian law. It cannot be, you cannot describe the special military operation as a war without committing a crime punishable by 8 to 10 years in prison. That is the extent to which the Putin regime has clamped down. Now, I'm not sure I fully answered your question. The period of 1911 and 1912, when Medvedev was president between 2008 and 2012, Medvedev was thought to be somewhat more liberal than Putin. When Putin decided he would come back as president and now is clearly president for life, that changed the possibilities, the trajectory that people imagined the government could still take. But I remember very vividly the elections of 2011 to the Duma, and then in anticipation of elections to the presidential elections of 2012, when the blatant corruption in the electoral process was so blatant. The carousel, it was called, where buses carried people from one polling place to another polling place. It created an enormous outrage and reaction in St. Petersburg. Massive demonstrations with white flags, which Putin derided as contraceptives. And the newspaper that is distributed free on the St. Petersburg Metro is called Metro, and I think you can find it in the New York Metro and everything else. It has a tirage, it has a publication of 100,000 copies, more than even not enough for the people who ride the Metro. Had the front page, your vote has been stolen. They are stealing Russia from us. And the whole paper was devoted to the way in which the carousel had spun and how your vote, our vote, was stolen from us. That's unthinkable now, but that's the degree to which changes were being made and the degree to which Russian society, at least in St. Petersburg and Moscow and Saratov and other major cities, were reacting to that, but without the power actually to change it. The principal competitor to Putin was Nemtsov, who I admired greatly and saw in the 1990s on television a lot, the mayor of Nizhny Novgorod, who was assassinated within, as you may remember, within eyesight of the Kremlin, because he was the only viable contender, Medvedev not being a viable contender, to Putin's power. So that's essentially the answer to your question. Dismal, isn't it? Yes?
Can you unpack for us Putin's claim that Ukraine is part of Russia, historically, culturally, and other ways?
Sure. So basically the way to unpack that is to realize that that the concept of a nation state, that is that nationalities, France, Germany, are entitled by virtue of their nationality to have their own state based on the nation, a relatively modern concept. That is French Revolution, early 19th century. Before that, there were regions in Russia. Ukraine was one of them. Russia, obviously, another. Muscovy, it was called, rather than Russia. The areas that ultimately constituted the empire that Peter the Great and Catherine the Great forged was not a nation state. It was a state of very diverse nationalities. And as the nation state idea became more prominent and with the United States and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and so forth, the French Revolution, the currents of nationhood spread to this area. Finland and Poland were the first. Finland was a part of Russia, and Poland was a province of Russia until 1917, incidentally. Finland managed to get its independence from Russia after the Treaty of Vienna, after the Napoleonic Wars were over. In that period, within Ukraine, there were an increasing number of writers and public figures, Shevchenko and Khrushchevsky, and an increasing number who argued that Ukraine was a nation and was deserving of its own state. But the Tsarist regime didn't recognize that for Ukraine, and didn't recognize it for the peoples of Siberia or the peoples of the Caucasus or Poland or other areas, the Baltic areas. All these areas were part of the empire. In 1917, during the course of the revolution, the liberal provisional government acknowledged the rights of nation to self-determination. And the first nation, the first group that declared its desire to be an independent nation and not under the Russian Empire was Ukraine. The Russians had already recognized that Poland needed to be set as an independent state, but Ukraine caused a great deal of consternation in Russia. Ukraine declared its independence for a brief period of time after the Bolsheviks came to power between 1917 and early 1918. As the Germans occupied Ukraine after the Brest-Litovsk period, they recognized Ukraine as an independent state, but the idea of independence was crushed in Ukraine by the victory of the Bolsheviks during the Civil War. Now, I don't want to have too long an explanation to your question, but the longer historical aspects of this are related to these origins. In the course of Soviet development, the Soviet constitutions in succession all promised independence, the right to self-determination for all nations. But the question is, could a bourgeois capitalist society declare its independence? And what it actually meant was no. The right to self-determination was limited to those republics who were happy to be Soviet socialist republics. And the Bolsheviks, in the period between 1918 and 1924, even a little bit earlier, managed to do that by, in various ways, putting Bolshevik loyalists into local positions. And so the Soviet Empire, the collection of 15 republics, including Ukraine, was welded together. But it wasn't welded together. It was brought together and forced together. And the breaking point for Ukraine, I think, might have been in the Holodomor, which is the great famine of 1932, which killed maybe 2, maybe 3 million Ukrainians, that Stalin imposed on this area at a period of great penury and hunger in Russia to get Ukrainian grain from the Ukrainians into other parts of Russia. And the Ukrainians as a society, diverse society, to a person suffered that in famines. And that was the beginning, I think, of the modern, post-revolutionary modern press for the importance of getting out from under Russian domination. Of course, Stalin was not a Russian, Stalin was a Georgian. But the Soviets and the Stalin regime imposed this on Ukraine. So that when the opportunity came in 1990, instigated particularly by Yeltsin, who wanted the Russian Republic and was advocating from 1987 to onward that the Russian Republic should not obey the laws of the Soviet Union, it should obey its own laws and have its own constitution, was joined by Kravchuk from Ukraine and Lukashenko from Belarus in a private meeting and said, yes, all three of us, we will not obey the laws of the Soviet Union, we will only obey our own laws. This is in the summer of 1991, and by December of 1991, elections were held in Ukraine, which established it as an independent state. Now, it's an independent state, obviously, but it's multi-ethnic insofar as you think of Ukrainians and Russians as different ethnicities. They speak a somewhat different language, as you probably know. There's an enormous amount of intermarriage between Ukrainians and Russians. Ukrainians, in the personal experience that I've had with my Ukrainian friends, have felt when they were in Russian institutions somewhat secondary citizens, harder to get into the institute if you're a Ukrainian than if you're a Russian. Depends who you know, but if you're a Ukrainian, you don't quite know the same people other people know. So the right to self-determination was quickly embraced in Ukraine, and generally embraced in Ukraine, whereas it never became a particular issue in Russia. Russia was the end of the empire, as it was. The other republics that declared independence left and by and large went their own way. Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Turkestan, the Georgian republics, and Russia did not develop the same sense of Russian nationality that these other republics developed. So I think that's the longer-term historical background to this notion of being a Ukrainian. But I will say that my Ukrainian friends, and I have many, including the chair of the Department of History in the Kharkiv University, which was bombed already in March, in the destruction. I know that area very well. I've been to Kharkiv many times. It's unbelievable, indescribable, unbelievable to me, and to him, and to others. I have to confess that no one can actually know why he did it. There are all sorts of explanations. He was a KGB professional. He believed in the Soviet Union. The collapse of the Soviet Union he regarded as the geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. He has this kind of vision and notion that he's going to restore. It's completely fantastical. He thinks like a 19th century imperialist in a 21st century world. He's cut off from reality. Anybody who's cut off from reality is either neurotic or worse. Whether he is neurotic or worse, depends on the time of day and where he is. But he certainly is not capable, for whatever reason, of understanding the situation rationally. Because insofar as he wants Russia to be greater, make Russia great again, and insofar as he wants to integrate Ukraine into Russia in some important way, this is the worst possible way of doing it. He could have, if he was interested in reintegrating Ukraine into Russia, he could have done that in a variety of ways, and for a while we thought in the 1990s and early 2000s, it would do it through an economic union, through extensive political exchange, and scholarly exchange and personal exchange, so that the kind of neighborhood would be different, but it would be integrated. And the Ukrainians, obviously, Russia was their biggest trade partner, and I think that Ukrainians, many of whom are Russian-speaking, and I should say a large proportion of Ukrainians have relatives in Russia, which is also navarot. A lot of people in Russia have relatives in Ukraine and scared to death about what's happening to them. I think that would be a way of, it could have integrated Ukraine into a greater, greater sphere of prosperity and even political, not compromise, but political coexistence. But he chose to do something which was a shock. I have to say that I kept saying up to February 23rd to my Ukrainian friends and that I didn't think it was going to happen. 150,000 troops. I said, but I cannot conceive that Putin would actually launch an invasion of Ukraine. That's incomprehensible. And that degree of shock has not only rippled quickly through Ukraine, especially with the aftermath of what the early invasion brought to Ukraine, but rippled through the consciousness of my colleagues, who were embarrassed and not only embarrassed but ashamed and feeling desperate and powerless to be part of a country that was inflicting this kind of damage on people who were historically very close to them and in literal fact relatives and friends and all the rest of it. And shock is really the right word, and it's a shock that people, I think, some people will never get over. I cannot see Russia, regardless of the outcome of Ukraine. Now I'm talking about the Putin regime, but I'm talking about Russia as a country. I cannot see Russia regaining its place in the international order as a respectable partner, G7, G8, whatever Security Council. I cannot see that for maybe a generation or more, which is why this is such a perilous moment, because the isolation of Russia from this circle of trading partners and people committed to maintaining order is extremely, I think, perilous for the order itself.
If what you have described, we I think have seen, reaches the definition of a Holocaust, of an annihilation of a people, in terms of international law, is it possible that the international community could do more than sanctions and shipping arms?
So I would respond to that question in several ways. We had warning that this was a military strategy to evoke terror in the population and to destroy the infrastructure. We had warning in the Chechen wars. We had warning in Yeltsin's first Chechen war, but we especially had warning in Putin's Chechen war in 2000, 2001. The leading general of which is now in command of the troops in Ukraine. This was a strategy. It was a strategy to terrorize the population, to destroy its, not only its infrastructure, but its ability to live in housing and all the rest of it. And that was a strategy to suppress the Chechen. Nobody paid a great deal of attention to that, except some very admirable and now, sadly, tragically, largely dead reporters in Russia, like Politkovskaya, who unveiled the nature of the Chechen invasion and was assassinated as a consequence, and others as well, like Paul Klebnikov, who was also assassinated not for the Chechen thing, but for the mafia thing and the integration of business into the government, corrupt business into the government. So this is a strategy which makes it even worse. to some extent, the argument is that Russia doesn't have sophisticated enough artillery, so that there is no precision in most of Russian artillery. That's probably true. I can't say that it is or isn't, but people who say that seem convincing to me. And that means that, but some of the targets are clearly designated. Civilian targets, like the train station in Kramatorsk and the railroad station in Lviv, and also in Kiev, clearly targeted for that purpose. Sanctions is a very tricky thing. On the one hand, I think one has to do something when Crimea is suddenly annexed, and when Donetsk and Luhansk are invaded. They were invaded, even though the rationale was they were asked to come in by local people, but local people were already planted there and so forth. And there was some separatist movement there, but that was a cultivated invasion. Sanctions are the only weapon, I think, that one can use initially without going to war, in this case and other cases. But they don't usually work. They haven't worked in Iran. They haven't worked in Cuba. They're not working in Russia. If anything, they are consolidating support for Putin. I have one friend who, when I talk to him on the telephone, won't talk about anything else about the sanctions. Why are you doing this to us? We didn't start the war. We're suffering. Why should we suffer? What is America doing to us, forcing us to suffer because of the behavior of our government, which we despise? And the language is such that I've insisted we not talk on an open line. We'll talk on Telegram or one of these encrypted lines. Very powerful feeling. So I think that's a widespread opinion, that Russians are used to poverty. They don't mind, I wouldn't say they wouldn't mind, but impoverishment in support of a great cause, which is this operation in Ukraine defending Russia against NATO invasion and all the rest of it. It's not going to affect Putin, and it's not going to change public opinion against the regime. So, is there an alternative? So, we have had to disengage our relations with European University, not only because the Russian regime has made it risky for our colleagues for us to continue, but because we are subject, myself and the 5 other American colleagues who are on the Board of Trustees with 12 Russians, we have gotten good legal advice. To what extent does our involvement with the European University violate the sanction rules? And we've been told that it does violate the sanction rules because we are giving counsel to and supporting a Russian institution. The European University is a non-state Russian institution. It's an independent institution. It's not a government institution. And I told my colleagues, I want us to continue supporting European University, and if the sanctions people come after us and say, we're going to sentence you to exile in Idaho for 8 years, I'm willing to take that risk. I'm willing to take that risk. The risk pales in relation to what our Russian colleagues are experiencing. So the sanctions are messy. There's a huge office in the Department of Treasury pertaining to almost overwhelmingly to business, not to charitable institutions like our Fund for the European University, which is a charitable friends 501c3 type 2 organization, but still we have been told in no uncertain terms that we violate the sanction rules. So it makes no sense for people like myself, pardon me, to be so self-referential, no sense for people like myself to risk the wrath of the American government trying to rescue and help the people in Russia who are the only hope we have to maintain something of a civilized society in a completely uncivilized world.
Can we really make a blanket statement that the sanctions aren't working? Yes, the oil prices have delivered benefits to the Russians, but I know middle-class business people in Russia who have left because they cannot get the technical sanctions that are preventing them from getting?
Well, it's a good question, Gayle, and people differ about the sanctions. But the fact that people left suggests to me that the sanctions aren't working. And the fact that Russia has been deprived of future investments suggests to me that the sanctions are designed to cripple the economy, according to the logic that crippling the economy will force the population to rise up and oust Putin, which won't happen. Insofar as Russian businesses have forced people abroad, and no doubt they're part of the 100,000 that Kommersant has recorded have left, it's hard to see how that constitutes them working. We might disagree about that, and you may be right and I may be wrong about this. I don't see an alternative to sanctions. You need to do something. But I don't, yeah, we're
a little bit over.
We're over.
Should we have one more question and then wrap up?
Could you comment on the performance of the Russian army?
I have to tell you that I was discharged in my military service as a corporal, so I am not, very expert. So what I would say about the Russian army is that the reports that I've read and talked to, people that I've talked to, make me believe that there are serious problems right now that Putin is facing with respect to the army. It's called, the offensive is called a special military operation because he can't declare a war. War, Russians would resist. Special military operation sounds like a police action, the way the United States has often described its military interventions. The effort right now, which you probably have seen in the newspapers because that's where I get this information right now, that the Russians have pretty well exhausted their regular army troops and are mobilizing people from lower ranks of the population, impoverished people, bomzhi as they're called in Russian, as well as the poorer nationalities, especially the Tajiks, and people who are called the Limitchiki, who are Caucasian peoples living in Moscow, a very tenuous existence in Moscow, a right to live there. And the government is promising them from $200 to $1,000 enlistment bonus, and then sending them right to the front in Ukraine. Now this speaks to the weakness of the Russian army as an army. It could be remedied if there is a mobilization, certainly a mobilization, but could only be remedied if there's mobilization and troops were trained. So you have an army with untrained troops and superior artillery against an army with untrained troops like Ukrainians, but desperate to fight, and there's a balance there. I would say one more thing. I heard from a Ukrainian friend whose family is in western Ukraine, Chernovtsi, that the news that's going around is that there actually are 3 new battalions that have been formed in the Ukrainian army. One of KGB people who were left in Ukraine and horrified by this and have, like Vlasov did in the Second World War against the Nazis, have organized their own polk, their own troops. And a second, Belarusians, who came into Ukraine to fight against Russia, having lost the opportunity to fight against Lukashenko. You know, whether that's true or not, there are no KGB volunteers in the Russian army, and the Belarusians in the Russian army are impressed, not volunteers as well. You've been very patient, and I thank you for your
See anyone racing for the door. That was nothing short of brilliant. Thank you for all those threads that you provoked us with in your opening remarks. Clearly, it opened up our minds and our questions. Your depth of knowledge is nothing short of amazing. So thank you for sharing that with us so generously. And let's give him another round of applause. Let me just say, next week we have the president of the College of the Atlantic, which is a gem of an institution that especially does work in the area of environmental issues. So I hope you'll join us again next week. Wonderful to see you all, and good night.